technology director. He had testified last month about being concerned that prosecutors didn't turn over information to George Zimmerman's defense team. And this, to me, speaks to how politicized and how divided this case has become. Because he's not the only one who kind of was what they call in Hollywood a shapeshifter. Supposed to be on one side, ends up being on the other side. What about the detective Chris Serino, right? He testified, but yet he did, in a certain sense, help the defense. Is that what a detective is supposed to do?
You know what?
Help the defense.
It's an interesting point. I want to bring Jason Johnson in on this because, Jason, I think Jane's hit the nail right on the head. Yeah. The idea that this has become in some ways politicized because usually, I said this all throughout the case, Jodi Arias' case, do you remember who was sitting next to Juan Martinez the whole time?
Oh,
Esteban
Detective
Flores,
right.
The lead detective. And Jason, this is one of those cases where maybe in some ways there was a disconnect between the police, the prosecutors. We see this IT guy right here. Talk to us about that and the relationship between all these parties that in many cases didn't seem to be on the same page as you would normally see in high-profile criminal cases.
No, they weren't. And I've never seen anything like it. I mean, Detective Serino could very likely be looking for another job or at least facing another demotion when this case is over, because you do not talk about breaking the blue shield. You do not get on the witness stand and attempt to directly undermine the state's case. You got to work with these guys later. And I think he should be handing out resumes right now because the state, no matter what the ruling is, whether George Zimmerman is found innocent or guilty, clearly Serino felt that he was pressured. He did not like having to be involved in this case, and he tried to stop the state any way he could, and he could be a difference maker.
But also because he suffered as a result of this case. He was transferred, right? Mm-hmm. He originally had been the lead detective, and he ended up being transferred out of that role ultimately because of the political nature of this, whether to charge him, whether not to charge him, what to charge him with if you are going to charge him, and there was a lot of disagreement about that.
Right, and I think what's key here is this. Detective Serino has been a police officer for 15 years. I find it difficult to believe that this is the first time in his entire career as a police officer that somebody looked over his shoulder and said, nah, I think we should push it this way or push it that way. So either he's the most ethical cop on the face of the planet, either he's Frank Pimpleton and he's Serpico, and he just so much believes in George Zimmerman that he has to undermine the case, or he threw a temper tantrum on the witness stand. It's one of the two.
Well, or there's a third possibility. Here's the thing. People are supposed to be objective when they're carrying out their roles, whether it's journalists, whether it's detectives, whether it's judges, whether it's state attorneys. But we're all human beings. And this case touches buttons in people that sometimes they can't help but betray their feelings, not just about this case in particular, but about the larger issues. And we all know what those larger issues are.
The other part of this, though, Jane, is when was the last time you saw a lead detective in a case say, I think the defendant was telling the truth? Remember how they had to strike that?
Yes.
Remember when, guys, the jury was left with those words and left for the night? They went to bed thinking, George Zimmerman's telling the truth. Game over. That was going through their heads. The judge came back and struck it the next day. And you know what? It gives me a chance to bring in Janet Johnson. And Janet, that was one of